If Byzantium had a heartbeat, it pulsed through stone, mortar, and towering gates, rising in layers that seemed to defy both gravity and time. The Theodosian walls were not merely defenses. They were a statement carved into the earth, declaring that Constantinople was untouchable. Built in the early 5th century and stretching for miles across the landward side of the city, these fortifications combined moats, outer walls, inner walls, and massive towers into a system so advanced that generations of attackers would break themselves against it. Some historians argue that no structure in medieval history saved more lives, delayed more invasions, or preserved more knowledge than these walls. To those who lived behind them, the walls were comfort, certainty, and proof of divine protection. The clang of gates closing at dusk signaled safety, while the echo of footsteps along the battlements reminded citizens that vigilance was constant. From atop the towers, guards could see enemy camps forming long before danger reached the city, reinforcing the belief that Constantinople stood beyond the reach of ordinary fate. Yet, invincibility is a dangerous illusion. As decades turned into centuries, the walls encouraged a subtle complacency, a sense that no matter how powerful an enemy became, stone would always prevail. Siege after siege failed, from Persian armies to Arab caliphate, and each survival strengthened the myth that the city was chosen, protected by God and engineered beyond defeat. But walls do more than keep enemies out. They shape the minds of those within. Resources flowed toward maintaining fortifications and ceremonies rather than reforming armies or addressing internal weakness. Emperors relied on diplomacy, bribery, and delay, trusting that the walls would buy time, as they always had. The sound of enemy drums outside the city often ended not in conquest, but in withdrawal, reinforcing the belief that patience was the ultimate weapon. Still, every crack repaired, every tower rebuilt, whispered a warning that stone ages just as empires do. Technology beyond the walls slowly changed. Siege engines grew stronger, and new ideas spread through distant lands. Yet inside Constantinople, the walls stood unchanged, monumental and reassuring. As we move onward, from one mystery to the next, we must ask whether the greatest strength of Byzantium also became its greatest weakness. When a civilization trusts its defenses more than its adaptability, what happens when the world learns how to break what once seemed unbreakable? When Justinian ascended the throne in the 6th century, he inherited not merely an empire, but an idea, the lingering belief that Rome could still be whole again. To Justinian, Constantinople was not the end point of Roman history, but its launching point. Some historians describe him as visionary, others as dangerously obsessed. Yet all agree that his reign reshaped Byzantium more dramatically than any ruler since Constantine. From the echoing halls of the Great Palace, Justinian imagined an empire restored, its lost western provinces reclaimed, its laws unified, its faith clarified. Armies marched across the Mediterranean under generals like Belisarius and Narses, carrying the emperor's will to North Africa, Italy, and beyond. For a time, the dream seemed possible. Cities fell, banners rose, and ancient Roman lands returned to imperial control. In Constantinople, the spoils of victory flowed into the treasury, reinforcing the image of an empire once again commanding the world. But ambition carries weight, and Justinian's vision demanded constant sacrifice. Taxes increased, conscription deepened, and the strain of distant wars stretched the empire's resources thin. Even as victories accumulated, unrest simmered at home. The Nika riots erupted in the heart of the capital, turning streets into battlegrounds and threatening to topple the emperor himself. Thousands died before order was restored, and the message was clear. The empire's grandeur rested on fragile foundations. Justinian responded not with retreat, but with control. He commissioned the codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, seeking to impose order not only on territory, but on society itself. Laws reached into every corner of life, binding subjects more tightly to the state. Faith, too, was enforced with new intensity, as Justinian pursued religious unity with uncompromising force, suppressing dissent and reshaping doctrine. Yet even as the empire expanded, another enemy moved silently through its streets. Plague arrived in waves, hollowing the population, emptying markets, and leaving the city eerily quiet. Seeps of silence replaced the roar of ambition. Justinian's empire stood at its widest reach, yet it was exhausted, strained, and vulnerable. As we move from conquest to consequence, one question lingers like a shadow over his reign. Did Justinian save the Roman world by restoring it, or did he hasten its decline by demanding too much from an empire already stretched to its limits? Following the turbulence of Justinian's reign, Byzantium entered a period that many historians describe as a golden age, a time when art, learning, and culture flourished amid political maneuvering and external threats. The city of Constantinople, perched at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, glittered with mosaics, domes, and bustling marketplaces. The Hagia Sophia rose as a crown jewel of architectural genius, its massive dome seeming to float above worshippers, light streaming through. Hundreds of stained glass windows and reflecting off polished marble floors, creating an almost otherworldly glow. Scholars debated philosophy, translated ancient texts, and preserved knowledge that would have otherwise vanished into the obscurity of time. Trade routes hummed with activity, bringing silk, spices, and gold from distant lands, while the harbour of the Golden Horn teemed with ships that carried not only goods but ideas, stories, and intrigue. Yet beneath the surface of this flourishing culture, the empire's lifeblood, its borders remained under constant pressure. Persian and later Arab armies tested the eastern frontier, while Slavic and Bulgar tribes probed the northern defences. Byzantine generals, often outnumbered, relied on ingenuity, intelligence networks, and the infamous Greek fire to hold these lines. Internally, political intrigue never ceased. Emperors were deposed, rivals executed, and conspiracies hatched. Within the marble corridors of the Great Palace, some researchers suggest that this delicate balance of brilliance and danger became a defining characteristic of Byzantine civilization, a society that could produce breathtaking art while simultaneously orchestrating ruthless politics. Religion remained both a unifying and divisive force, with theological debates igniting passions as strongly as any battlefield clash. Icons, liturgies, and doctrinal disputes shaped daily life, influencing everything from imperial policy to tithe. The rhythms of the city streets, Byzantine citizens, priests, and soldiers alike learned to navigate a world where loyalty was constantly tested, and where survival demanded both faith and cunning. As we move next into the empire's confrontation with the rising tide of external enemies, we will see how the golden splendor of Constantinople could not shield Byzantium from the inexorable pressures building along its frontiers. nor from the slow, insidious fractures that threaten to unravel centuries of history. The question lingers in the silent halls of the Hagia Sophia. Can a civilization of such brilliance endure when the world beyond its walls grows ever darker and more dangerous? Byzantium's golden age, as luminous as it seemed, was shadowed by internal storms, none more profound than the era of iconoclasm, a period when the very soul of the empire seemed to tremble under the weight of theological strife. Imagine the silent halls of Constantinople, once vibrant with mosaics depicting saints and emperors, suddenly stripped bare, the faces of holy figures erased by imperial decree. The clash over icons was not merely artistic or religious. It tore at the fabric of Byzantine identity itself, dividing emperors from clergy, nobles from commoners, and families from each other. Some researchers suggest that this crisis reflected the empire's existential anxieties of people caught between tradition and reform, fearing divine wrath while striving to assert temporal authority. Others believe it was a calculated political tool used by emperors to consolidate power and suppress dissent, a weapon as sharp as any sword on the battlefield. The iconoclast emperors argued that veneration of images was idolatrous, a distraction from true faith, while iconophiles insisted that sacred images connected mortals to the divine, providing both spiritual comfort and moral guidance. The streets of Constantinople would have echoed with hushed whispers, clandestine prayers, and the secret work of artisans defying imperial orders, preserving fragments of gold and glass that whispered of faith under siege. Monasteries became clandestine centers of resistance, their libraries safeguarding not just sacred texts, but centuries of accumulated wisdom, while the threat of punishment hung like a shadow over those who dared to protect what was forbidden. The political consequences were equally tangible, as emperors who championed one side or the other faced assassination, revolt, or betrayal by those closest to them. Military campaigns were not immune, as the loyalty of troops could be swayed by religious sentiment, leaving borders vulnerable to opportunistic enemies. Beyond the immediate conflicts, the era of iconoclasm forced Byzantium to confront a profound question. Could a civilization survive when its moral compass itself was contested? And yet, through this turmoil, the empire endured, the sparks of creativity and devotion flickering behind shuttered windows and hidden altars, waiting for a time when the faith of a people would reassert itself and, with it, the resilient identity of Byzantium. As we move forward, we will witness how this struggle for spiritual integrity would intertwine with political survival, setting the stage for the empire's enduring resilience and the hidden vulnerabilities that would later shape its final centuries. The lifeblood of Byzantium flowed not only through its grand palaces and sacred churches, but also through the intricate networks of trade, coinage, and wealth that sustained an empire perched at the crossroads of continents. Picture the bustling streets of Constantinople, lined with merchants from every corner of the known world, the air thick with the scent of spices, the tempts of salt from the nearby harbour, and the chatter of countless tongues, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and beyond. The Byzantine economy was a delicate orchestra, where gold, solidus coins, minted with the emperor's image, moved like currents through marketplaces, monasteries, and military pay chests, carrying not just wealth, but the authority of the state itself. Some historians argued that the stability of the soleus was one of the empire's greatest achievements, a beacon of financial reliability in an era often marked by turmoil and inflation elsewhere. Trade routes stretched from the frozen ports of the Black Sea to the bustling bazaars of Cairo, linking silk and spices, wine and olive oil, glass and precious metals, creating a web of interdependence that both empowered and exposed the empire. Yet, beneath the surface of prosperity lurked vulnerability's heavy taxation weighed on peasants, while corruption in distant provinces siphoned wealth toward private coffers, and political instability often disrupted the delicate balance of commerce. The imperial government intervened in trade, regulating guilds, setting prices for essential goods, and sometimes even controlling the supply of bread and grain to prevent famine, demonstrating an acute awareness that economic control was inseparable from political survival. Maritime trade depended on the Byzantine navy, whose fleets protected merchant vessels from pirates and rival powers, while land routes across Anatolia and the Balkans carried goods through a patchwork of cities and fortified way stations. The city's grand bazaars were not merely centers of commerce. They were theaters of cultural exchange, where ideas, fashions, and knowledge traveled as freely as gold coins. Some scholars suggest that this economic sophistication allowed Byzantium to project influence far beyond its military reach, creating soft power that endured even as armies faltered. Yet, as wealth flowed into the empire, it also attracted envy, predation, and internal strife, seeding conflicts that would echo through the centuries. And as we turn our gaze to the next chapter, we will see how this intricate economy, so vital to the empire's survival, intersected with diplomacy, war, and the relentless pressures of an ever-changing world, revealing how even the mightiest empires can be both strengthened and imperiled by the very systems that sustain them. Byzantium was not merely an empire of walls, churches, and coins. It was a state defined by the subtle, shadowy art of diplomacy, a world where words, promises, and carefully calibrated gestures could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Imagine the corridors of Constantinople's palaces, where tapestries muffled footsteps and candlelight flickered across marble floors, casting long, uncertain shadows as envoys from distant lands whispered, negotiated, and schemed. The Byzantine approach to diplomacy was meticulous, almost surgical, relying on intelligence, psychological insight, and the delicate manipulation of allies and enemies alike. Ambassadors traveled from Antioch to Venice, from Trebizond to Cairo, carrying gifts, letters, and veiled threats, their arrival announced by trumpets or concealed behind the quietest of processions, depending on the message. Some reasons argue that Byzantium's survival for over a millennium owed more to this web of alliances and subterfuge than to its formidable walls or armies. Emperors like Justinian and Constantine navigated a world crowded with potential adversaries. The Persians in the east, Slavic tribes and Bulgars in the north, the rising power of the Arabs, and later, the Turks. In these dealings, Byzantium mastered the delicate balance of marriage alliances, treaties, bribes, and the occasional display of military might, all calculated to maintain the empire's precarious equilibrium. Secret intelligence networks, often operating through merchants, monasteries, and local nobility, allowed the court to anticipate invasions, plot countermeasures, and exploit the ambitions of neighboring rulers. The art of diplomacy was not merely reactive. It was proactive, often employing cunning deception, false alliances, or the careful distribution of wealth to weaken potential threats before they could strike. Yet, this reliance on negotiation and intrigue could also be a double-edged sword. Intentions or over-reliance on distant allies sometimes led to disaster, as when promises of Western aid failed to materialize against Ottoman encroachment. Beyond politics, Byzantine diplomacy had a cultural dimension, projecting the empire as the inheritor of Rome, the guardian of Christian orthodoxy, and the arbiter of civilization itself. Embassies were accompanied by lavish gifts, intricate ceremonies, and displays of artistry designed to awe, impress, and subtly intimidate. And as we move next to explore the military foundations of Byzantium, we will see how diplomacy and war were not separate arenas, but intertwined strategies, each shaping the other, and each revealing how a civilization could survive centuries on the razor's edge between power and vulnerability. The Byzantine army was not merely a collection of soldiers. It was a living, breathing organism, shaped over centuries into a precise instrument of defense and projection of power, where discipline, strategy, and adaptability intertwined to create one of the most sophisticated military forces of the medieval world. From the clang of bronze armor to the distant thrum of war drums echoing across Anatolian plains, the army's presence was felt as much through sound as through sight. Central to its organization was the theme system, a unique administrative and military innovation that divided the empire into districts, each responsible for raising, equipping, and maintaining its own troops. Farmers could be warriors, men, plowing the fields by day and training with spear and bow by night, creating a populace intimately invested in the empire's survival. Some historians suggest this blending of civilian and military life allowed Byzantium to survive invasions that would have overwhelmed less organized states, while others argue it was a reflection of necessity or resourceful solution to limited manpower and vast territorial challenges. At the heart of the army were professional soldiers, such as the Tagmata, stationed near Constantinople, highly trained and loyal directly to the emperor. They formed the backbone of rapid response forces, capable of marching hundreds of miles in weeks, disciplined in formation, fighting, siegecraft, and cavalry tactics. The cavalry itself, heavily armored cataphracts and lighter horsemen, struck with precision and mobility, often outmaneuvering enemies who underestimated their speed or endurance. Siege engines, ranging from massive trebuchets to intricate counterweight devices, were developed and refined over generations, reflecting a deep understanding of engineering, geometry, and the psychological impact of warfare. Infantry units worked in coordination with cavalry, archers, and engineers to create a seamless defensive and offensive network. Yet, even the most disciplined army could not act in isolation. Logistical mastery, including supply lines, granaries, and the careful movement of fodder and weapons across challenging terrain, was essential. The Byzantine army's strength lay not merely in numbers or equipment, but in doctrina's strategic approach that valued intelligence, deception, and patience over brute force. Ambushes, feigned retreats, and flexible defensive lines allowed smaller Byzantine forces to survive encounters with larger armies, prolonging the empire's existence when conquest seemed inevitable. And as we move next into the empire's legendary navy, we will see how Byzantium extended this blend of ingenuity and resourcefulness to the sea, controlling trade routes, defending harbors, and creating weapons that inspired fear across the Mediterranean. keeping the empire alive for centuries against relentless foes. The Byzantine navy was a force as mysterious and formidable as the empire itself, an arm of defense that combined ingenuity, terror, and unmatched maritime strategy to control the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Imagine vast wooden galleys, their hulls carved with precision, cutting through waves while the wind whistled through taut sails, the sea spray carrying the smell of salt and tar. At the heart of the navy's legendary power was Greek fire, a weapon that inspired awe and fear, a liquid fire that could not be extinguished with water, engulfing enemy ships in roaring flames that lit up the night like infernos from another world. Some scholars believe the formula was a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few imperial engineers, while others suggest it was a combination of petroleum, resin, and mysterious additives, creating a chemical marvel centuries ahead of its time. The navy was organized into fleets that patrolled key harbors, trade routes, and strategic straits, with Constantinople itself becoming an island fortress, its chains stretched across the Golden Horn to prevent incursions, the water, a deadly trap for any who dared approach. The coordination between fleet and shore batteries reflected a sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics. As rowers, marines, and artillery crews worked in harmony, their discipline rivaling that of the land armies, ships were equipped not only for combat, but for rapid deployment of troops, carrying cavalry, infantry, and siege equipment to distant shores, projecting Byzantine influence far beyond the capital. Training was relentless, with crews practicing maneuvers, boarding actions, and emergency procedures, cultivating an instinctive precision that could turn the tide of battle in moments of chaos. Beyond the practical, the navy served as a symbol of imperial power, a floating manifestation of authority that reminded allies and enemies alike that Byzantium still commanded respect and fear. Supply chains, shipbuilding yards, and naval arsenals were maintained with meticulous care, reflecting the empire's understanding that control of the sea was inseparable from survival. As we transition from the navy to the labyrinthine politics and cored intrigues of Constantinople, it becomes clear that Byzantium's survival was never simply a matter of walls and weapons. It was the delicate interplay of strategy, loyalty, and deception that allowed a city surrounded by enemies to endure for centuries, a dance of power that would ultimately define both the empire's triumphs and its tragic vulnerabilities. Next, we delve into the corridors of the imperial palace, where ambition, betrayal, and intrigue intertwined, shaping the fate of emperors and the very soul of the Byzantine state. Step inside the imperial palace of Constantinople, a sprawling labyrinth of marble halls, gilded ceilings, and shadowed corridors, where the air is thick with incense, whispered schemes, and the subtle tension of power constantly in flux. The Byzantine court was as much a battlefield as the frontiers, a place where ambition and survival coexisted in delicate balance, where every gesture, word, and favor carried weighty consequence. Emperors were surrounded by advisors, generals, eunuchs, and courtiers, each maneuvering to advance personal agendas, secure influence, or protect family fortunes, all while maintaining the facade of loyalty. Some researchers suggest that this constant dance of intrigue gave the empire a unique flexibility, allowing rulers to quickly adapt to threats, while others argue it eroded trust and sowed internal instability, weakening Byzantium at critical moments. Factions within the court were often tied to powerful families, influential military officers, or even external powers, each pushing agendas that could shift the balance of authority in an instant. Intricate ceremonial rituals reinforced the emperor's divine status. Yet these displays masked an undercurrent of competition, as the slightest misstep could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death. Marriage alliances and strategic appointments were weapons of influence, binding nobles to the throne while creating a web of obligations and rivalries. Ambassadors from foreign courts arrived with subtle bribes, gifts, and threats, weaving their own narratives into the palace's complex fabric, as Byzantium's position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia made diplomacy an art of both persuasion and deception. The emperor's private chambers, often opulent yet isolated, served as a theater where critical decisions were made, informed by intelligence networks that monitored both domestic factions and enemy movements. Court historians and chroniclers recorded events with careful language, sometimes glorifying rulers, other times embedding veiled criticisms, creating a legacy that complicates our understanding of truth. Within this environment, conspiracies were never unusual. Plots to depose emperors, assassinate rivals, or manipulate succession were recurring threads in the empire's tapestry. And the palace itself often became a site of sudden, violent change. As we leave the glittering yet treacherous halls of Constantinople's court, it becomes apparent that Byzantium's political life was a mirror of the empire itself, brilliant, complex, and shadowed by danger, a realm where knowledge, cunning, and timing could determine life or death. From the intrigues of the palace, we now move to the broader stage of diplomacy and warfare, where the Byzantine state projected its influence across empires, negotiating survival in a world of constant threat and shifting allegiances. Imagine standing at the walls of Constantinople, the morning fog rising from the Golden Horn, as envoys from distant lands approach under the shadow of the city's towering battlements. Byzantium was a civilization perpetually balancing on the knife's edge between survival and collapse, its diplomacy a careful dance between negotiation and intimidation. Some historians suggest that the empire's survival for over a millennium owed more to cunning diplomacy than to military might, while others argue that its reliance on negotiation exposed Byzantium to repeated humiliation and dependency. Ambassadors arrived from the courts of Western Europe, the rising powers of the Ottomans, and distant Islamic states, each carrying gifts, threats, and coded messages. Testing the empire's resilience and its leaders' judgment, Byzantium wielded treaties, tributes, and marriage alliances as tools of survival, often paying off enemies to delay invasions or manipulating rival factions to create advantage. At the same time, the empire's armies, though often outnumbered, reflected a tradition of strategic brilliance honed over centuries of conflict. The fielding of highly trained cavalry, the use of Greek fire on both land and sea, and the careful fortification of key cities displayed a combination of technological innovation and tactical foresight. Yet, Byzantium's military strength was never absolute. Economic constraints, shifting loyalties, and the exhaustion of constant warfare limited the empire's capacity to project force. Naval power was critical, with fleets patrolling the Mediterranean to protect trade routes and enforce influence. But each engagement carried immense risk, as defeat could open the door to sudden invasion. Even within the empire, provincial governors exercised significant autonomy, and their loyalty could be swayed by promises of power or threats of reprisal, complicating centralized decision-making. The interplay of war and diplomacy often created a delicate balance, where a single miscalculation could lead to catastrophic consequences. Some campaigns were remembered as masterpieces of strategy, others as tragic failures that weakened Byzantium irreparably. In this realm of constant tension, information was as valuable as soldiers. Spies, informants, and intelligence networks shaped decisions as much as banners and catapults. As we follow the empire's efforts to maintain its borders, to negotiate with allies, and to fend off enemies, we begin to understand how Byzantium survived for centuries in a world of relentless change and unpredictable threat. From the foggy shores of diplomacy and the heat of battle, we now turn to the cultural heartbeat of the empire's art, architecture, and daily life that gave Byzantium its enduring character and mystique, even in the shadow of decline. Step inside the bustling streets of Constantinople, and you are immediately enveloped by a symphony of sights, sounds, and textures that speak to the empire's unique soul. Cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, the scent of spiced markets mixing with the salty tang of the Bosphorus, and the distant toll of church bells and mosque halls create an atmosphere of both reverence and vitality. Byzantium was more than walls and soldiers. It was a civilization of immense cultural sophistication, where art, architecture, and religious devotion intertwined in ways that mesmerized both contemporaries and later generations. Some scholars suggest that the visual grandeur of the city, with its gilded mosaics, soaring domes, and intricate icons, served not only as a religious expression but as a subtle form of political power, reinforcing the emperor's divine authority and the cohesion of society. Others propose that these artistic achievements reflected a deeper philosophical pursuit, a striving to bridge the mortal and the eternal through color, form, and light. The Hagia Sophia, with its immense dome seemingly suspended in midair, remains the crown jewel of Byzantine architectural innovation, a testament to both engineering genius and spiritual aspiration. As sunlight filters through the mosaic-covered windows, glinting off gold tesserae, one can almost hear the whispers of artisans, the echo of prayers, and the hum of civic life that animated the imperial capital. Beyond monumental structures, everyday life in Byzantium carried its own textures of intrigue and elegance. Markets brimmed with goods from the far reaches of the empire, and beyond silks from the east, spices from India, fine glassware from Alexandria, while scholars and scribes labored in dimly lit scriptoria, preserving classical texts that might otherwise have been lost to time. Music, theatre, and public ceremonies filled the squares, their rhythms punctuating the passage of seasons and the turning of imperial power. Even in domestic spaces, the richness of Byzantine culture was apparent in textiles, frescoes, and the subtle interplay of light and space. Yet, this vibrant cultural life existed alongside the ever-present tension of political intrigue, religious debates, and external threats. Artists and architects worked under the shadow of impermanence, their creations threatened by fire, invasion, and iconoclastic edicts, which only intensified the poignancy of their labor. As we leave the streets and temples of Constantinople and move toward the twilight of the empire, we will witness how these cultural achievements, intertwined with political maneuvering and spiritual devotion, both fortified and exposed Byzantium, setting the stage for the dramatic struggles that would define its final centuries. Imagine the bustling harbors of Constantinople, where the calls of sailors mix with the clatter of goods being loaded and unloaded from ships that have traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles. The scent of salt water and exotic spices lingers in the air, while merchants in vibrant robes haggle over silks from Persia, grain from Egypt, and furs from the northern steppes. The Byzantine economy was a complex web of trade, taxation, and craftsmanship that sustained an empire whose political survival often depended as much on wealth as on walls and armies. Some historians argue that the empire's control of strategic trade routes linking the Mediterranean with the Black Sea and beyond allowed Constantinople to accumulate immense wealth, while others suggest that the reliance on foreign goods and mercantile networks also made Byzantium vulnerable to economic disruption during times of conflict. Coinage, particularly the gold solidus, served not only as currency but as a symbol of imperial stability, recognized and trusted across Europe and the Near East for centuries. Streets of Constantinople were lined with workshops where skilled artisans produced intricate jewelry, religious icons, and finely crafted weaponry, blending practicality with artistry in ways that spoke to both economic necessity and cultural sophistication. The empire's taxation system, administered through a network of officials and provincial governors, extracted revenue that funded both lavish court life and the maintenance of formidable military forces. Yet, this wealth was unevenly distributed, creating social tensions between the elite aristocracy, urban merchants, and rural peasants who bore the brunt of fiscal demands. Agricultural production in the hinterlands provided the lifeblood of the empire, supplying grain, olive oil, wine, and other essentials that kept cities alive and armies provisioned. Some researchers believe that the relative efficiency of Byzantine logistics and supply chains enabled the empire to endure sieges and external threats that might have toppled less organized states, while others argue that dependency on imported luxury goods exposed systemic weaknesses that could be exploited by rivals. Beyond economics, the empire's prosperity influenced diplomacy and strategy, allowing Byzantium to pay tributes, fund mercenary armies, and wield influence over neighboring states. Yet even in times of wealth, the shadow of scarcity and vulnerability never fully lifted, reminding all who dwelled within its walls that fortune could change as swiftly as the tides of the Bosphorus. As we move from the markets and granaries to the political and military machinations that determined Byzantium's fate, we see an empire whose very survival depended on the delicate balance between wealth, power, and resilience. What happened when these forces faltered? Next, we explore the shifting tides of Byzantine politics, intrigue, and the relentless struggle for survival. Step inside the marble halls of the great palace of Constantinople, where the scent of incense lingers and every corridor whispers secrets of power and betrayal. The Byzantine court was a stage where ambition, loyalty, and deception intertwined. In an elaborate dance, with emperors, eunuchs, generals, and bureaucrats, each maneuvering for influence. Some scholars argue that the elaborate court ceremonies, from the emperor's daily appearances to the intricate hierarchy of titles and offices, were designed to awe and control both the populace and foreign envoys, projecting the image of an unshakable and divine authority. Others suggest that these rituals masked the constant undercurrent of tension, a network of rivalries that could erupt into conspiracies, rebellions, or assassination attempts. Decisions at the highest level were rarely simple, as every policy, whether military, economic, or religious, was filtered through competing interests: the aristocracy, the clergy, the urban elite, and the provincial governors, the emperors. Power, though theoretically absolute, depended on skillful negotiation, persuasion, and the occasional ruthless elimination of opponents. Eunuchs, often overlooked in historical accounts, wielded disproportionate influence within the palace, serving as secretaries, advisors, and gatekeepers to the emperor, able to shape policy while remaining untouchable by traditional military. Rivals, military generals, many of whom commanded personal loyalty from their troops, frequently played kingmakers, while ambitious relatives of the imperial family waited in the shadows for opportunity. Alliances formed and shattered with dizzying speed, and envoys carried messages and bribes that could tip the balance of power. Religious authority further complicated court politics, with patriarchs and monks weighing in on succession disputes, doctrinal debates, and foreign relations, their support often making the difference between stability and chaos. Popular opinion, expressed through riots, protests, or passive resistance, also held power, reminding emperors that legitimacy rested not solely on titles, but on perception. Some historians suggest that this intricate web of intrigue helped Byzantium survive for centuries, forcing rulers to be cunning, adaptive, and strategic. Others argue that internal divisions ultimately weakened the state, leaving it vulnerable to external threats, from Norman invasions to Ottoman encroachment. Within this crucible of ambition and danger, decisions were made that shaped the empire's destiny, sometimes with immediate consequences, sometimes echoing across decades. The palace was both a sanctuary and a battlefield, where whispers could kill, loyalty was fleeting, and the line between friend and enemy blurred. As the empire's political machinery struggled to maintain cohesion, the shadow of looming military threats never faded. Next, we will explore the Byzantine military itself, the soldiers, strategies, and innovations that defended a city that seemed impregnable, yet stood on the brink of history's most famous siege. Imagine standing on the ramparts of Constantinople, the sun glinting off towers and walls that stretch for miles, and hearing the distant clatter of armor and the rhythmic cadence of disciplined truths. The Byzantine military was not merely an army. It was a complex organism, honed over centuries, blending tradition, strategy, and innovation in ways that often surprised even their most formidable enemies. Some historians emphasize the thematic system, which organized provincial armies under local commanders, allowing rapid mobilization while maintaining regional loyalty. Others suggest that this system, while ingenious, sometimes created fragmentation, leaving the central command vulnerable to political interference or disloyalty. The soldiers themselves were a mix of professional troops, mercenaries, and citizen levies, each bringing unique strengths and challenges. Infantry units drilled tirelessly with spears, swords, and shields, mastering formations designed to repel cavalry charges or hold strategic positions against overwhelming numbers. Cavalry, often the pride of the empire, was trained to execute precise maneuvers, from feigned retreats to encirclement tactics, reflecting the empire's understanding of mobility and timing in warfare. Engineers and artisans played a critical role, designing fortifications, siege engines, and artillery that transformed battles into calculated displays of technical prowess. Greek fire, the infamous incendiary weapon, added a psychological dimension. Terrifying enemies who witnessed flames that could burn on water, sometimes deciding the outcome of naval engagements before blades met shields. Supply chains, often overlooked in popular narratives, were vital. Soldiers relied on meticulously organized logistics, from food and weapons to spare armor and medical care. Mercenary forces from Western Europe, the Caucasus, and Asia added skill and diversity, but also introduced unpredictability, as their loyalty often depended on payment or promise of plunder. Training emphasized not only physical skill, but discipline, morale, and cohesion, ensuring that eunuchs could respond to dynamic battlefield conditions with precision. Leaders such as Belisarius, those centuries earlier, became enduring symbols of military genius, and later commanders continued to adapt their strategies in response to evolving threats, from Seljuk Turks to Ottoman expansion. The military was inseparable from the empire's political and social fabric. Victories enhanced legitimacy, while defeats could trigger civil unrest or palace intrigue. As we prepare to witness the empire's final decades, it becomes clear that the soldiers standing on the walls were heirs to this rich tradition, yet they faced challenges unlike any their predecessors had known. Next, we move to the siege itself, the stage where centuries of strategy, technology, and human courage would collide in a drama that would forever reshape history. Picture the dawn of April 6, 1453. With a pale mist clinging to the walls of Constantinople, the air heavy with anticipation and the distant echo of drums and horns from the Ottoman encampment. The siege had begun, a culmination of years of tension, ambition, and meticulous planning. On one side, Emperor Constantine XI and his few thousand defenders, their numbers dwarfed by the approaching Ottoman army, moved with a quiet determination that belied the fear gnawing at every corner of the city. The Theodosian walls, formidable and ancient, stretched like a silent sentinel over the city, their towers and gates reinforced with hastily salvaged materials, yet already showing the wear of age and past assaults. On the other side, Mehmed II, the 19-year-old Sultan, orchestrated a symphony of siege warfare, blending brute force with engineering brilliance. Massive cannons, including the great gun designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, rumbled across the landscape, shaking the earth and throwing massive stone projectiles against the ancient fortifications. Clouds of dust and debris turning the air opaque, creating an almost apocalyptic atmosphere. Behind these mechanical giants, thousands of janissaries moved with disciplined precision, constructing trenches, palisades, and artillery emplacements, each action carefully choreographed to weaken, distract, and exhaust the defenders. From the Golden Horn to the landward walls, Ottoman ships were dragged over greased wooden roads, defying geography and the imagination, creating panic among defenders who had believed certain approaches to be secure. Amidst this chaos, defenders repaired breaches, manned towers, and fired arrows, Greek fire, and early artillery. Their every movement measured against the overwhelming pressure of numbers and firepower. Civilians, including women and children, became part of the city's defense, carrying ammunition, repairing fortifications, and sustaining morale through prayers and chants that mingled with the groans of collapsing masonry. Each day stretched into night and night into day, the psychological toll as heavy as the physical assault. The constant thunder of cannons, the cries of laboring soldiers, and the pervasive fear of divine abandonment created a tension that was almost tangible. An invisible weight pressing down on the walls. Some researchers suggest the defenders' morale was sustained by the presence of foreign experts like Giovanni Giustiniani, whose guidance and discipline offered a bridge to the broader European military tradition, while others emphasized the symbolic power of Constantine XI himself, standing among his people, a living embodiment of defiance. And yet, for all their courage, the balance of power teetered inexorably toward the Ottomans, whose combination of innovation, organization, and relentless pressure hinted at a tragic inevitability. As the siege stretched into weeks, the city became a crucible of human endurance, strategy, and desperation, setting the stage for a climax that would echo through history. Next, we move to the final assault of fateful hours, when centuries of Byzantine resilience would meet the unstoppable force of Mehmed II's ambition. As the first light of May 29, 1453, crept across the walls of Constantinople, the city braced itself for the moment that would decide its fate. The previous weeks of relentless bombardment had carved deep scars into the ancient fortifications, and every stone seemed to carry the weight of centuries of history. The air was thick with dust, the temps of smoke, and the metallic scent of blood mingling with fear and determination. Ottoman forces, numbering over 80,000, advanced in a coordinated assault along multiple fronts, their cries, drumbeats, and trumpet calls combining into a singular, almost hypnotic roar that reverberated through the city. Behind the walls, Emperor Constantine XI moved among his men, calm yet tense, issuing orders and encouragement, embodying the very soul of a civilization teetering on the edge of annihilation. Citizens and soldiers alike fought with a ferocity born of desperation, each arrow loosed and stone hurled against the invaders, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of culture, faith, and memory. Despite the defenders' courage, the Ottomans exploited every weakness, every lapse in vigilance. The discovery of a small gate left unsecured during a sortie allowed Janissary units to penetrate the inner defenses, a crack through which the tide of conquest poured. The disciplined Ottoman formations advanced through the breaches, their banners rising over walls that had withstood countless sieges, creating panic that spread like wildfire among the defenders. Constantine, shedding his imperial regalia, fought alongside his men, embodying both leadership and the tragic inevitability of his empire's end. Accounts suggest that he fell in the melee, his body later found among the dead, a poignant symbol of defiance and the collapse of an age. The city, once vibrant with the hum of markets, churches, and palaces, was now under the complete control of a new power, and the streets echoed with the cries of surrender, fear, and chaos. The fall was not merely military, it was psychological, cultural, and spiritual. Churches were looted, treasures carried off, and the Hagia Sophia transformed into a mosque, its mosaics covered, its Christian identity replaced by the mark of a new empire. Thousands were enslaved, families torn apart, and a civilization that had persisted through centuries of turmoil now faced the erasure of its political and social structures. Yet, in the midst of destruction, seeds of continuity survived the Byzantine scholars who fled westward, the Orthodox Church maintaining its traditions under Ottoman rule. and the echoes of Byzantine governance and law influencing new societies. The fall of Constantinople was both an end and a beginning, a violent transition that reshaped the Mediterranean world and set the stage for centuries of cultural, religious, and political transformation. From one mystery to the next, we now explore how the remnants of this empire lived on, quietly shaping the future while preserving the memory of a lost golden age. Even as the walls of Constantinople fell and the last Byzantine emperor met his fate, the essence of the empire refused to vanish entirely. The shock waves of the city's conquest rippled across Europe and the Near East, but fragments of Byzantine civilization survived in exile, in manuscripts, in scholars, and in ideas that would quietly shape the course of history. Among the fleeing intellectuals were men and women carrying collections of classical texts, maps, and philosophical treatises, their hands trembling with the weight of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Some found refuge in the Italian city-states, particularly Florence and Venice, where their arrival coincided with the budding Renaissance. There, Greek became the lingua franca of learning once again, and the teachings preserved in Byzantine. Libraries began to re-enter a Europe that had largely lost direct contact with classical antiquity. Names such as Cardinal Bessarion, George of Trebizond, and other émigré scholars became conduits, transmitting not just texts, but the intricate methods of Byzantine scholarship commentaries on Aristotle, Byzantine historiography, an advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Meanwhile, in the eastern regions formerly under Byzantine control, the Orthodox Church endured under Ottoman oversight, its hierarchy preserved through the millet system, the appointment of Gennadius Scholarius as ecumenical patriarch ensured that spiritual leadership remained intact, providing communities with a sense of continuity even as their political world crumbled. Byzantine art, architecture, and iconography continued to influence religious and cultural life. From the mosaics and frescoes of Orthodox churches to the architectural designs that blended Eastern and Western traditions, political theory too. The careful study of imperial authority, bureaucracy, and law seeped into European thought, influencing the way rulers conceptualized governance, sovereignty, and the delicate balance between church and state. The Justinian Code, preserved and studied, became a cornerstone for emerging European legal systems, its principles echoing in courtrooms centuries later. Beyond Europe, Ottoman rulers recognized the practical genius of Byzantine administration, adopting taxation systems, provincial governance, and even certain military organizational strategies. In this way, the empire's structures persisted not through dominance, but through subtle influence, a quiet testament to the resilience of an intellectual and cultural legacy. The fall of Constantinople, while catastrophic in immediate terms, paradoxically ensured the survival of Byzantine civilization in new forms, its ideas, its traditions, and its art continuing to ripple outward, shaping distant societies in ways the empire's last citizens could scarcely have imagined. As we reflect on the echoes of Byzantium, the question emerges: how did a fallen empire, crushed beneath the might of the Ottomans, continue to shape the world long after its final walls were breached? Next, we move to the enduring spiritual and cultural threads that wove Byzantine influence into the fabric of Europe and beyond, preserving a civilization in the shadows of its former glory. As the dust settled over the ruins of Constantinople, a new era began, Yet the shadow of Byzantium stretched far beyond its fallen walls, casting influence across continents, centuries, and civilizations. The empire, though politically extinguished, had planted seeds of knowledge, culture, and faith that would continue to bloom in unexpected ways. In Western Europe, the influx of Byzantine scholars ignited a rekindling of classical learning that fueled the Renaissance, transforming art, literature, and science. Manuscripts, once confined to the libraries of Constantinople's monasteries, and palaces found new homes in Florence, Rome, and Venice, introducing Western thinkers to forgotten texts of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy. These texts carried not only knowledge, but the subtle methodologies of Byzantine pedagogy, emphasizing careful commentary, comparative study, and analytical reasoning, laying the foundations for a wave of intellectual rigor that would reshape the continent. Beyond the purely intellectual, Byzantine aesthetic sensibilities survived in art and architecture. The intricate mosaics, gold-leaf icons, and soaring domes of the Orthodox tradition influenced both Orthodox and Western Christian visual culture, blending symbolism, geometry, and narrative in ways that continue to inspire modern architecture and religious spaces. Politically, the Byzantine understanding of imperial authority, diplomacy, and legal codification seeped into the thinking of Renaissance rulers and jurists. The Justinian Code's rationalized structure of laws, its blend of civil and moral principles, and its insistence on bureaucratic order became reference points for emerging European legal frameworks, providing a model for balancing governance with justice. Even in the East, the Ottoman Empire absorbed and adapted Byzantine administrative practices, from taxation and provincial governance to military organization, proving that the practical wisdom of the old empire could survive under new rulers. Transformed but functional. Religiously, the Orthodox Church preserved Byzantine theological, liturgical, and cultural identity, nurturing communities across the Balkans, Russia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Russian Empire, in particular, claimed the mantle of the Third Rome, asserting spiritual continuity and imperial legitimacy rooted in Byzantium's legacy. Yet perhaps the most profound and haunting element of Byzantium's enduring shadow lies in the collective imagination stories of emperors, saints, scholars, and artists who resisted time, conquest, and oblivion. The fall of Constantinople became both a historical lesson and a symbol, a cautionary tale of resilience, hubris, faith, and ingenuity. And so, even as the final walls crumbled and the last banners fell, the Byzantine Empire lived on not in armies or crowns, but in the quiet persistence of ideas, faith, and culture echoing across generations, waiting to be discovered, studied, and marveled at. In this lingering shadow, we find the true immortality of Byzantium, a civilization that, though vanquished, continues to whisper its mysteries, challenge our understanding, and inspire curiosity in every corner of the world. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift to a city that was never meant to exist, a city born not from accident, but from intention, from fear, from hope, and from the quiet realization that the world was changing, long after the old Rome began. To crack under the weight of its own greatness, another Rome was rising in the east, wrapped in mist and seawater, guarded by stone and prophecy. This was Constantinople, a city balanced between continents, between ages, between belief and power. And for more than 1,000 years, it refused to disappear. While empires around it rose and fell like waves against rock, Byzantium endured, reshaping itself again and again, never quite ancient, never fully medieval, always something in between. To some, it was the Roman Empire's final form, refined and hardened. To others, it was something entirely new, a Christian empire clothed in gold, ritual, and silence. The streets echoed with prayers in Greek, the air carried incense and sea salt, and above it all stood walls so vast they felt eternal, as if stone itself had learned how to resist time. But endurance always carries a price. Every layer of survival hides cracks beneath it, and every victory plants the seeds of a future loss. The Byzantine Empire would become a place of dazzling ceremony and brutal politics, of scholars preserving ancient knowledge while enemies pressed closer each year, of faith used as both shield and weapon. It was an empire that slept lightly, always listening for footsteps at the gate. And yet, for centuries, those gates never fell. How did a state surrounded by enemies, racked by internal conflict, and burdened by the legacy of Rome manage to outlive almost everyone who came for it? Was it geography, belief, strategy, or something harder to name, something woven into the identity of the city itself? As we move deeper into this story, from one mystery to the next, we begin not with collapse, but with a decision. A single moment when one man looked eastward and imagined a future where Rome could live again, transformed, vigilant and watching the horizon. And the question that lingers now is simple, yet heavy. What kind of empire is born when survival becomes its greatest purpose? Close your eyes and imagine standing on a narrow peninsula where two continents almost touch, where dark blue waters churn with invisible currents, and the wind carries voices from distant shores, because it was here that an emperor believed history itself could be redirected. Constantine the Great did not simply choose a new capital. He envisioned a transformation, a quiet abandonment of a fading world in favor of one that could still be controlled. Rome, old and burdened, lay far to the west, its power diluted by distance, politics, and decay. In the east, however, trade flowed endlessly, armies could move faster, and threats could be seen before they arrived. Some historians believe Constantine was guided by pure strategy. Others suggest faith played an equal role, shaped by visions and divine reassurance. What is certain is that, in the year 330, the small Greek city of Byzantium was reborn as Constantinople. The city of Constantine, a place meant to outlast chaos itself. Marble streets replaced worn stone, forums rose where fishing boats once rested, and palaces gleamed beside churches still heavy with the scent of fresh mortar. This was not merely a capital, it was a statement, a declaration that the Roman world was not ending, only shifting its center. The city's position allowed it to command sea routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, controlling trade, movement, and war with equal efficiency. Walls were expanded, harbors deepened, and ceremonial life was carefully designed to project authority and continuity. Yet beneath the celebration, uncertainty lingered. Pagan traditions still clung to the empire even as Christianity began to reshape imperial identity. Constantine's policies reflected this tension, blending old rituals with new symbols, allowing both worlds to exist uneasily side by side. Statues of ancient gods stood not far from churches dedicated to a single, all-seeing deity, And this coexistence raised quiet questions about the empire's future soul. Was Constantinople the final evolution of Rome, or the first step toward something entirely different? As the emperor walked through his new city, surrounded by banners and acclamations, he could not have known that this place would become the longest surviving seat of Roman power in history. Yet every brick laid carried a silent challenge to time itself. From this dream of permanence, an empire began to take shape, one that would define survival as an art. And as the city's foundations settled into the earth, one question remained, suspended in the air. Could a city designed to last forever truly escape the fate of all empires before it? As Constantinople grew into its role as the heart of empire, something unseen yet powerful began to weave itself into every stone, every ceremony, and every law, shaping the Byzantine world from within. Christianity, once persecuted and whispered in shadows, was now rising alongside imperial authority, and the union between throne and altar would define Byzantium for centuries to come. Some scholars believe this alliance gave the empire its greatest strength, while others argue it planted the seeds of endless conflict. What is certain is that faith became more than belief. It became structure, identity, and justification. Churches multiplied across the city, their interiors glowing with gold mosaics that shimmered in candlelight, depicting saints with watchful eyes and emperors crowned not just by men, but by divine approval. Rituals grew elaborate, carefully choreographed to remind all who witnessed them that imperial power flowed from heaven itself. The emperor was no longer merely a ruler. He was God's representative on earth, tasked with protecting orthodoxy as fiercely as borders. Laws reflected this transformation, blending Roman legal tradition with Christian morality, shaping daily life in ways both subtle and absolute. Yet unity proved elusive. Doctrinal debates erupted over the nature of Christ, debates so intense they split cities, armies, and even families. Councils were convened, creeds written, and heresies condemned, but each decision seemed to create new fractures. Some communities resisted imperial doctrine, others embraced it too fiercely, and religious disagreement often spilled into open violence. Gold flowed constantly into the capital, funding churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions that fed the poor and cared for the sick, reinforcing the idea that Byzantium was a chosen empire, protected and guided by God. At the same time, this wealth drew envy and resentment from beyond its borders. To outsiders, Constantinople appeared impossibly rich, its churches dripping with treasure, while distant lands struggled to survive. Faith became both shield and target, inspiring devotion within and hostility without. As belief tightened its grip on the empire, it also narrowed the space for compromise, making every political dispute feel cosmic in scale. Each theological argument carried the weight of eternity, and every defeat threatened not just territory, but divine favor. As we move forward, from one mystery to the next, we are left to wonder whether Christianity saved the Byzantine Empire by giving it purpose, or doomed it by binding survival to faith itself. And if an empire believes God stands behind its walls, what happens when those walls begin to crack?